Now that we've set the stage by discussing some of the conceptual features of stock, let's start with the analysis process and going through a few models to estimate the intrinsic value of common stock. So we're going to talk about the discounted dividend model, the corporate valuation model, and then a little bit about the PE multiple approach and the EVA approach. So first let's start with the discounted dividend model. What the discounted dividend model is doing is it's saying that the value of a stock is the present value of all the future cash flows, and those future cash flows are dividends. And because a corporation goes on forever, then we're going to say that the dividends go on forever. So if we know the value of all of those dividends that will be paid across the future life of this company, we can just discount them back to today, add them together, and that's what the stock is worth. Now, that's going to be a little bit difficult because how do I know what dividend the company is going to pay 97 years from now? So instead, what we do is we figure out, or we estimate the growth rate of the stock and whether or not we think that growth rate will be constant or not. And so we're first going to start with this constant growth stock. So a stock whose dividends are expected to grow at a constant rate forever its value can be estimated using this constant growth model. And so we're going to call that constant growth rate G, and then we're going to use the formula at the bottom to solve for P hat. Remember, a hat is always some expected or desired value. So P hat 0 is equal to the dividends today times 1 plus the growth rate divided by the required return on the stock minus the growth rate. In that numerator, D0 times 1 plus G is also equal to the next period dividend, or D1. So here we're just showing that the future dividends are increasing, and so the more they increase, the greater the value of the stock. So now what happens using this formula if our growth rate is greater than the required return? Well, then we're not going to be able to use this formula because we're going to get a negative stock price, and that just won't work. So usually what's happening if we have G greater than RS, that's usually temporary. And so we're going to talk about another model to consider in that case. So let's just work through the constant growth model, but first we need to know the required rate of return on the stock. So let's figure that out using CAPM, which we've already gone through. So now if we're given the risk-free rate and the return on the market and beta, we can calculate the required return using CAPM. So in this example, we're finding that the required return on the stock is 13%. So now if we know that the most recent dividend was $2 and the growth rate is constant at 6%, we can also figure out the future dividend. So in here, we're just going to figure out the next three. So D1 is going to be D0 times 1 plus G, or $2 times 1.06. And then D2 will be $2.12 times 1.06, and so on. And then if we take the present value of each one of those dividends, that's what's showing up under the 0 column, and then we add those together, we'll get the value of the stock today. And again, we took the present value using the required return on the stock. So now if we put it all together, D1 was $2.12. We said that required return on the stock was 13% and the growth rate was 6%. So that gives us a value of the stock today of $30.29. And so then if we wanted to know the stock's value 1 year from now, which would be P hat 1, we could just put in D2 and divide that by RS minus G, and now we get $32.10. So another way to do it would just be to take P0 times 1 plus G. So now, what if we wanted to find the dividend yield and the capital gains yield during that first year? Well, the dividend yield is going to be D1 divided by P0, so that's $212 divided by $30.29, which gives us 7%. But now, because we know that the the total return on the stock is the dividend yield plus the capital gains yield, then we know that the capital gains yield has to be 6%. So we can figure it out the long way, taking P1 minus P0 divided by P0, or we could have just done 13 minus 7 to give us 6. And so here we're backing into it to prove to you that the total return on the stock is equal to the required return on the stock, because now we're talking about in equilibrium, because CAPM is an equilibrium model. So that means that the required return is equal to the total return, which is equal to the dividend yield plus the capital gains yield. So now, what if the expected price today, or what would be the expected price today if G is equal to 0? Well, that would be the case of preferred stock, where the dividend is not growing. It's constant over time. So then that would just be the dividend divided by the required return, or in this case, $2 divided by 13%. So that would give us a price of $15.38. Now, probably the most difficult part of this section is supernormal growth. So that's that case I mentioned earlier where you have a stock that's growing at where G is maybe even higher than RS, but it's not sustainable over time. So now we've got a 30% G for 3 years, and then it will slow down to 6%. So we can't use the constant growth model. And so what we're going to do is figure out what G is, those 3 years or figure out what the dividend is, those 3 years that G is very high at 30%. So those values are the $2.60 and $3.38 and so on. Then we can figure out a what's called a horizon value. So in this case, it's going to be P3. So P3 is the year before the growth rate levels out. So P3 is going to be P4 over R minus G. D4, I hope I said D4, D4 over R minus G. So now we have cash flows for year 1, 2, and 3. Our cash flow in year 1 is D1, year 2 is D2, and year 3 is D3 plus P3. Now we would put all of those into the cash flow worksheet and solve for net present value. And then to get dividend yield just works the same way as before and the same as capital gains yield. Same thing would happen if it was 0% growth rate, and then we would do the same calculation for dividend yield and capital gains yield. Same thing if we have a negative growth rate. And same calculation for dividend yield and capital gains yield. So another big thing that you should be seeing is that the capital gains yield is just G.